Hi everybody, Dana here again, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips for Leaders of Volunteers. And this week talking about Needs Assessment 101, how to do these evaluations, and I'm including links in the video description below to a couple of really just very helpful, useful free templates that you can use for your organization or use as a starting point and refine it a little bit more towards your mission or the kinds of departments, the type of work you do. But when you're talking about a needs assessment, it's most often associated with something pretty big in a reorganizational way, like a strategic plan, but I prefer to do needs assessments really every year or two and kind of set up that machine of perpetual motion of plan, do, check, act, which I've talked about in previous videos, but just kind of covering the basics, kind of needs assessment 101, just to make sure that you've got kind of the major categories and the ways that these should help improve the agency's efficiency and being able to have a positive mission impact. And because that's my focus, I'm also going to focus on kind of cultural competency and what that means for volunteer and community engagement, because those are usually subcategories within these larger topics. So the results that you want to get from a successful needs assessment is you want the agency to have strong governance and oversight. So that can be the board, the executive directors, an advisory council, whatever leadership structure you have in your agency, but strong governance and oversight, good management practices, and a healthy organizational culture. You want everyone, including volunteers and paid employees in every department, to have the resources to carry out the mission and accountable management of funding for that goal. Fourth thing, you want to have communications and relationships with people who give you money and their time and their talent. So donors and volunteers as stakeholders is a really important thing to include at every part of a needs assessment, especially if it's attached to a strategic plan. And what you use to create the success of your work, help meet your missions, and carry your message. So kind of communications and relationship building should be improved after a needs assessment. And finally, number 5, an efficient and effective program structure or services delivery structure and administrative system. So this can seem kind of dry, but there's actually a lot of, not just in number 4, a lot of relationship building and more subtle soft skills, people stuff that relates directly to community engagement and volunteer engagement, especially strategic volunteer engagement, because a needs assessment tells you what's really going on, and a lot of that is how supporters, including volunteers and donors, are engaged with your agency, and is that being done in the best way possible for win-win for everyone involved. So the general categories in a needs assessment typically fall under these umbrellas of mission, strategy, and evaluation. So strategic plan kind of falls right into that. Leadership, board, staff, and volunteers. Legal, compliance, and ethics. Finance and operations. Resource development, not just fundraising, but any kind of resource, including community partnerships and relationships, so resource development, and public awareness, engagement, and advocacy. And again, ideally, strategic community engagement, strategic volunteer engagement weaves through all of those things. Some of you may be in organizations where all of your board members or your friends of or your advisory council are volunteers. Well, who's in charge of that? If you're a government agency, that's probably a clerk of the board as a staff position if you have elected board members. But if you have volunteer board members or advisory council or friends of members, then hopefully that's under volunteer services, that's handled by the person who has the expertise on volunteer engagement in the agency. So when you're doing a needs assessment, another tool that I'll be sharing pretty shortly in the next couple of months comes from Rosanna Galindo, who has developed the Volunteer Satisfaction Index. So that's going to be a deeper dive with her with priceless advice and Tuesday tips coming up later this summer. But for Needs Assessment 101, if you're thinking about planning and evaluation, when you include stakeholders, be absolutely certain to include major volunteer leaders, people who have been volunteers for a very long time with your agency, usually have great knowledge and kind of institutional wisdom, and maybe they've seen or been through several other changes and they can say this is what's working, this is not. Also check in with your volunteers as major stakeholders in any needs assessment, not just using this tool that I'll share in a little while later, the Volunteer Satisfaction Index, but also these are usually your front-facing, interacting with clients, constituents, the public. Most often a group of people are the agency's volunteers. So if you're in any kind of planning process, find a way to check in with volunteer staff, tenants, customers, key constituents, that they can participate in the needs assessment and the planning process if there's a strategic plan. And for cultural competency, a lot of agencies I know have been working on diversity, equity, inclusion, sometimes also called IDEA. My friend Sean, who is on Priceless Advice, calls it IDEA, or DEIAJ, or JEDI. So there's a lot of different acronyms, but really it boils down to kind of a cultural competency and everyone being on the same page to create a welcoming environment. One of the biggest points of failure, or even pain points, that I see working with agencies is that they're having a high churn. They're having trouble attracting volunteers, they're having trouble attracting donors, and the reality of the experience when they do either a program assessment or an overall needs assessment for the whole agency is that people aren't having good initial interactions, good communications, or there isn't enough follow-up or enough engagement after initial contact to kind of, again, build that relationship and build that communication as a real two-way frequency, two-way street, listening sessions, so that it's not just we're talking at the volunteers and telling them this is how it's going to be, that you're getting involvement from key stakeholders that are really doing the work every day. So if you've been working on cultural competencies, how to make volunteers and clients, customers, constituents feel more welcome, feel more belonging, if you're doing outreach to specific target audiences, as they say in marketing, then any kind of needs assessment is going to be extremely useful to any of that work. So take the templates that I've shared below, share some other examples, or share some experiences in the comments of how you have gone through any sort of needs assessment or evaluation. I, again, really think it's most useful when all staff and volunteers, team members, are evaluated regularly in their performance with accountability, and that there's a fair system for volunteers and employees, that it's not a separate or siloed system simply because of a pay category. There's certain regulations with employees that are different than regulations with volunteers, but essentially the surveys, the program needs assessment, and any kind of stakeholder conversations should be fair and equitable and accessible to all of your team members. So I hope you enjoy these Tuesday tips. Check in with more next week and let me know what you think in the comments below. Hit like, subscribe, and the little bell icon to know when I have new videos loading, especially some priceless advice coming up. Thanks.